The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble floors of the royal palace as consort Helena walked through the corridors with calculated grace. Her emerald silk dress rustled softly with each step, and her jeweled fingers traced the cold stone walls as she made her way to the council chambers. Today was different from all the other days she had spent in this magnificent prison of power and politics. Helena had spent 15 years in the palace, arriving as a young woman of 20 when she caught the eye of King Edmund during a festival in her home province. She was not born into nobility, but her beauty and sharp mind quickly earned her a place among the king's favored consorts. Unlike the other women who competed for the king's attention through tears and dramatic scenes, Helena chose a different path. She observed, she learned, and she planned. The king was now 63 years old, and his health had been declining steadily over the past 2 years. His cough had grown worse, his hands shook when he thought no one was looking, and he spent more time in his chambers than in the throne room. The kingdom whispered about his condition, though no one dared speak openly about what everyone knew was coming. Prince Marcus, the heir to the throne, was everything Helena despised about the royal family. At 31 years old, he possessed his father's stubborn nature, but none of his wisdom. Marcus spent his days hunting, drinking with his companions, and showing little interest in the actual work of governing. Helena had watched him for years, noting how he dismissed the concerns of the common people and how he treated the palace staff with casual cruelty. Helena's own son, Thomas, was now 16 years old. Though he was not the legitimate heir, he carried the king's blood in his veins. More importantly, he had inherited Helena's intelligence and her hunger for something greater than the life of a forgotten prince. Thomas was everything Marcus was not. Thoughtful, curious about the kingdom beyond the palace walls, and genuinely concerned about the welfare of the people. The idea had been growing in Helena's mind for months, like a seed planted in fertile soil. Why should Marcus inherit a throne he did not deserve simply because his mother had been the queen? Why should her brilliant son be condemned to a life in the shadows while an unworthy man ruled over millions of people? Helena had begun reaching out to various nobles and court officials, carefully testing their loyalty to the current system. She discovered that many shared her concerns about Marcus's fitness to rule. Lord Chancellor William, an elderly man who had served 3 kings, had confided his worries about the kingdom's future under Marcus's leadership. Several military commanders had expressed similar doubts in private conversations. The more Helena thought about it, the more convinced she became that her plan was not just possible, but necessary for the good of the kingdom. She began to frame her ambition not as a personal desire for power, but as a patriotic duty to save the realm from an incompetent ruler. Helena's first major move was to arrange a series of meetings with influential nobles under the guise of social gatherings. She hosted elegant dinner parties where the conversation naturally turned to politics and the future of the kingdom. She was careful never to speak directly against Marcus or to openly promote Thomas, but she planted seeds of doubt and allowed others to voice the concerns she herself felt. During one such gathering, Duke Richard of Westmore, a man known for his military expertise, mentioned his worries about the kingdom's defenses under future leadership. Helena listened sympathetically and then casually mentioned how impressed she had been with Thomas's recent discussions about military strategy. She did not push the point, but she could see the Duke filing away this information for future consideration. Helena also began to strengthen her relationship with Queen Isabella, Marcus's mother. This might seem counterproductive, but Helena understood that keeping potential enemies close was often more effective than avoiding them entirely. She offered the queen comfort during the king's illness and positioned herself as a loyal supporter of the royal family. This gave her access to information about the queen's plans and concerns, while also ensuring that she would not be seen as an immediate threat. The consort's most clever move was to begin including Thomas in more palace activities and official functions. She arranged for him to attend council meetings as an observer, to join diplomatic receptions, and to participate in ceremonial events. This served multiple purposes. It raised Thomas's profile among the nobility, demonstrated his capabilities to potential supporters, and normalized the idea of him playing a role in governance. Thomas himself was initially unaware of the full scope of his mother's plans. Helena had raised him to be ambitious and intelligent, but she had been careful not to burden him with treasonous thoughts while he was still a child. As he grew older and began to understand the political realities of palace life, Helena gradually shared more of her vision with him. The young prince proved to be an eager student of his mother's lessons in power and politics. He began to see how his half-brother's weaknesses could become opportunities, and he started to believe that perhaps his birth circumstances should not determine the limits of his future. Thomas was particularly motivated by his genuine desire to help the common people of the kingdom, something he had observed firsthand during carefully arranged visits to the villages surrounding the capital. Helena's network of supporters continued to grow throughout the winter months. She was careful to recruit people slowly and to test their commitment before revealing too much of her intentions. She found allies among younger nobles who felt overlooked by the current power structure, among military officers who respected competence over birthright, and among court officials who had grown frustrated with Marcus's indifference to governance. The consort also began to gather intelligence about potential obstacles to her plans. She learned which nobles were most loyal to Marcus, which military units could be counted on to support the legitimate heir, and which court officials might pose problems if her scheme was discovered. This information would prove crucial in the months ahead. As winter turned to spring, Helena felt increasingly confident that her plan could succeed. She had built a substantial network of supporters. Her son was gaining recognition and respect throughout the palace, and the king's health continued to decline in ways that might provide opportunities for dramatic action. However, Helena made one crucial error in her calculations. She assumed that Marcus was too self-absorbed and too focused on his pleasures to pay attention to the subtle shifts in palace politics. She believed that his lack of interest in governance meant he was also blind to threats against his position. This assumption would prove to be a dangerous mistake. Marcus might have been an indifferent student of statecraft, but he had inherited more of his father's cunning than Helena realized. Moreover, he had allies and supporters of his own who were watching carefully for any threats to the established order. The stage was now set for a confrontation that would determine not just the future of the royal family, but the fate of the entire kingdom. Helena had built her network, positioned her son, and prepared for her moment to strike. She believed she was ready to claim the throne that she felt her son deserved, and that the kingdom needed. What she did not anticipate was that her careful planning and gradual approach had given her enemies time to prepare as well. The prince's fury, when it finally erupted, would be swift, decisive, and devastating to all of Helena's ambitions. The first crack in Helena's carefully constructed plan appeared on a humid Tuesday morning in late spring. Sir Geoffrey, one of Marcus's closest friends and hunting companions, had been drinking heavily at a tavern in the lower city when he overheard two minor nobles discussing the young Prince Thomas and his growing popularity among certain court circles. The conversation was not overtly treasonous, but something about the tone and the meaningful glances between the speakers caught Geoffrey's attention. Geoffrey was not a political man by nature, but his loyalty to Marcus was absolute. They had grown up together, trained together, and shared countless adventures. More importantly, Geoffrey possessed a shrewd understanding of human nature that he usually kept hidden behind his jovial exterior. He began to pay closer attention to the subtle currents of palace life that he had previously ignored. Over the next several weeks, Geoffrey noticed patterns that troubled him deeply. He observed how certain nobles seemed to defer to Thomas in ways that went beyond mere politeness. He noticed how Helena managed to insert herself and her son into important conversations and events. Most concerning of all, he detected a shift in how some people spoke about the future of the kingdom, with less certainty about Marcus's eventual rule and more speculation about alternatives. Geoffrey decided to share his concerns with Prince Marcus, though he was careful to frame his observations as general worries rather than specific accusations. Marcus initially dismissed his friend's concerns, pointing out that palace intrigue was as old as the monarchy itself, and that minor jealousies and ambitions were perfectly normal. However, Geoffrey's words planted a seed of suspicion in Marcus's mind. The prince began to observe palace life with new eyes, and what he saw gradually convinced him that his friend's worries were justified. Marcus noticed how his half-brother Thomas seemed to appear at every important gathering, how Helena had somehow become central to many social and political discussions, and how certain nobles who had once been reliable supporters now seemed distant or distracted. The turning point came during a formal dinner celebrating a trade agreement with a neighboring kingdom. Helena had arranged for Thomas to sit near the foreign ambassadors, and the young man impressed everyone with his knowledge of languages and international affairs. Marcus watched as several influential nobles nodded approvingly at Thomas's comments and saw how his half-brother naturally took on a leadership role in the conversation. After the dinner, Marcus confronted his father about Thomas's increasingly prominent role in palace affairs. The king, weakened by illness and eager to avoid conflict, dismissed his son's concerns and praised Thomas's intelligence and potential. This response only increased Marcus's suspicions and convinced him that he could not rely on his father to protect the rightful succession. Marcus began his own investigation using different methods than Helena had employed. Where she had been subtle and gradual, he was direct and forceful. He summoned nobles to private meetings and demanded clear statements of loyalty. He questioned military commanders about their commitment to the legitimate heir. He used his authority as crown prince to access information that had previously been hidden from him. What Marcus discovered horrified him. Helena's network was larger and more organized than he had imagined. She had carefully recruited supporters across different levels of the palace hierarchy, from powerful dukes to minor court officials. Some of these people had been approached with vague suggestions about the kingdom's future, while others had been directly asked to consider supporting Thomas's claim to the throne. Most disturbing of all, Marcus learned that Helena had been meeting secretly with military commanders and had even reached out to foreign ambassadors to gauge their potential support for a change in succession. These actions went far beyond normal palace intrigue and entered the realm of actual treason. Marcus realized that he faced a genuine threat to his inheritance and to the stability of the kingdom. Helena's supporters were not merely ambitious nobles seeking personal advantage. They included people who genuinely believed that Thomas would make a better ruler than Marcus. This made them more dangerous because they were motivated by conviction rather than just greed. The prince also understood that he had to act quickly and decisively. Helena's plan was clearly advancing towards some kind of climax, possibly timed to coincide with the king's death or during a period when the king was incapacitated. Marcus could not afford to wait and see what she would do next. Marcus began to assemble his own coalition of supporters, drawing on nobles who remained loyal to the traditional succession and military officers who valued stability above all else. He also reached out to Queen Isabella, his mother, who had been largely unaware of Helena's activities, but who possessed considerable influence and resources of her own. The queen was shocked to learn about Helena's betrayal, particularly since she had considered the consort to be a friend and ally. Isabella's anger at being deceived and manipulated added emotional fuel to what was already a serious political crisis. She immediately pledged her full support to Marcus and began using her own network of supporters to counter Helena's influence. Marcus's response was swift and comprehensive. He used his authority as crown prince to reassign several military commanders who had been compromised by Helena's recruitment efforts. He arranged for loyal nobles to be given important positions that had previously been held by Helena's supporters. Most importantly, he began to limit Thomas's access to official functions and council meetings, effectively isolating him from the political process. Helena quickly realized that her plans were unraveling, but she was not prepared to abandon her ambitions without a fight. She attempted to accelerate her timeline and push for a more direct challenge to Marcus's position. This proved to be a critical error, as it forced her to abandon the subtle approach that had served her so well and to take actions that were obviously treasonous. Helena's most desperate move was to approach foreign ambassadors directly and request their support for Thomas's claim to the throne. She argued that Marcus was unfit to rule and that the kingdom's allies would benefit from having a more capable leader. These conversations were reported back to Marcus within days, providing him with clear evidence of treason that he could present to his father and to the broader court. The evidence of Helena's treachery was now undeniable. But Marcus faced a delicate political situation. Simply arresting Helena and Thomas would create a scandal that could destabilize the kingdom and potentially lead to civil conflict. Moreover, many of Helena's supporters had been recruited through subtle manipulation and might not even realize that they had been drawn into a treasonous conspiracy. Marcus decided on a strategy that would expose Helena's ambitions publicly while minimizing damage to the kingdom. He arranged for a grand council meeting where all the major nobles and court officials would be present. His plan was to present evidence of the conspiracy in a formal setting where Helena would be forced to defend her actions before the entire court. The announcement of the grand council meeting sent ripples of anxiety throughout the palace. Helena knew that Marcus had discovered her plans, but she was not certain how much evidence he possessed or how he intended to proceed. She considered fleeing the kingdom with Thomas, but realized that such an action would confirm her guilt and destroy any remaining chance of success. Instead, Helena decided to take one final, desperate gamble. She would use the Grand Council meeting as an opportunity to present her own case against Marcus and to argue publicly that Thomas should be recognized as the rightful heir. This would be an open declaration of rebellion, but Helena believed that she had enough support among the nobles to make such a bold move successful. Thomas, now fully aware of his mother's plans and his own precarious position, supported Helena's decision to fight openly rather than surrender quietly. The young man had grown up believing that he deserved better than the life of a forgotten prince, and he was not willing to abandon his dreams without making one final attempt to claim what he felt was rightfully his. The stage was now set for a dramatic confrontation that would determine the future of the royal family and the kingdom itself. Both sides had committed themselves to courses of action from which there could be no retreat, and the Grand Council meeting would serve as the arena where their competing claims would be decided once and for all. The great hall of the palace had never witnessed such tension as it did on the morning of the Grand Council meeting. Every major noble in the kingdom had traveled to attend, along with military commanders, court officials, and foreign ambassadors. The massive stone chamber, with its soaring columns and ancient tapestries, seemed to hold its breath as the various factions took their positions. King Edmund, despite his failing health, had insisted on presiding over the council meeting. He sat on his throne, looking frailer than ever, but his eyes remained sharp and alert. Queen Isabella stood to his right, her face a mask of controlled fury as she watched Helena enter the chamber with Thomas at her side. Helena had dressed for the occasion in deep purple silk, a color traditionally associated with royalty, and she wore a diamond tiara that caught the light from the tall windows. Thomas, now 17 and tall for his age, walked beside her with the bearing of someone born to rule. They took their places among the assembled nobles, but Helena's supporters seemed nervous and uncertain about what was to come. Prince Marcus entered last. wearing the formal uniform of his military rank with the golden sash that marked him as heir to the throne. His face was grim and determined, and he carried a leather portfolio that everyone assumed contained evidence of Helena's conspiracy. Sir Geoffrey and other loyal supporters flanked him as he made his way to his position near the throne. King Edmund called the assembly to order with a voice that was weak, but still commanded respect. He began by addressing the rumors and tensions that had been building within the palace, acknowledging that serious accusations had been made that required formal investigation and resolution. Marcus stepped forward and presented his evidence methodically and carefully. He detailed Helena's recruitment efforts among the nobles, her secret meetings with military commanders, and most damning of all, her attempts to secure foreign support for Thomas's claim to the throne. Each accusation was supported by witness testimony and written evidence that Helena could not deny. The assembled nobles listened in shocked silence as the full scope of Helena's conspiracy was revealed. Many of those who had been approached by Helena realized for the first time that they had been drawn into a treasonous plot. Others who had remained loyal to Marcus felt vindicated in their support for the legitimate heir. When Marcus finished presenting his evidence, King Edmund asked Helena to respond to the accusations. This was the moment Helena had been preparing for, her final chance to turn defeat into victory through the power of her words and the strength of her convictions. Helena rose to her feet and addressed the assembly with passionate eloquence. She did not deny the accusations against her, but instead argued that her actions had been motivated by love for the kingdom and concern for its future. She painted Marcus as an unfit ruler who cared more about his own pleasures than the welfare of his subjects. She described Thomas as a young man of exceptional intelligence and character who had been denied opportunities simply because of his birth circumstances. Helena's speech was powerful and moving, and for a moment it seemed as though she might actually convince the assembly to support her cause. Several nobles nodded in agreement with her criticisms of Marcus, and even some of the prince's supporters appeared to be considering her arguments. However, Helena made a crucial error in her desperation to win over the assembly. She claimed that King Edmund himself had privately expressed doubts about Marcus's fitness to rule and had indicated support for Thomas as an alternative heir. This was a complete fabrication, but Helena hoped that the king's poor health and reputation for discretion would prevent him from contradicting her publicly. King Edmund's reaction to this lie was swift and devastating. Despite his physical weakness, the elderly monarch rose from his throne with surprising strength and dignity. His voice, when he spoke, carried all the authority and power of his 40-year reign. The king declared that Helena's claim was false and that he had never expressed any doubt about Marcus's right to inherit the throne. He condemned Helena's conspiracy as an act of treason that threatened not only the royal family, but the stability of the entire kingdom. Most importantly, he formally reaffirmed Marcus as his chosen heir and ordered that anyone who had participated in the plot against the legitimate succession should face immediate consequences. The impact of the king's words was immediate and decisive. Helena's remaining supporters quickly abandoned her cause, unwilling to continue supporting someone who had been so publicly condemned by the monarch himself. Military commanders stepped forward to pledge their loyalty to Marcus, and foreign ambassadors distanced themselves from any association with Helena's failed conspiracy. Prince Marcus, seeing that his position was now secure, could have chosen to show mercy to Helena and Thomas. Instead, his fury at their betrayal overcame any impulse toward clemency. He had spent months watching his inheritance threatened and his legitimacy questioned, and he was determined to ensure that such a challenge could never arise again. Marcus ordered the immediate arrest of Helena and Thomas on charges of high treason. Palace guards moved quickly to surround them, and within moments the woman who had aspired to place her son on the throne found herself in chains alongside the young man whose ambitions had been crushed before they could fully flower. The prince also ordered the arrest of several key supporters of Helena's conspiracy, particularly those who had actively recruited others or who had provided material support to the plot. However, he showed calculated mercy to nobles who had been approached by Helena but who had not actively participated in treasonous activities, recognizing that the kingdom needed unity rather than further division. Helena's fall from power was as dramatic as her rise had been gradual. The woman who had spent 15 years carefully building influence and relationships found herself stripped of all status and privilege within a matter of hours. Her apartments were searched and sealed, her possessions confiscated, and her servants dismissed. Thomas, who had grown up believing that he might someday rule the kingdom, now faced the prospect of imprisonment or exile. The young man's dreams of power and his genuine desire to help the common people had been crushed by his mother's overreach and his half-brother's ruthless response. The trials of Helena and Thomas were swift and decisive. The evidence against them was overwhelming, and they had little choice but to plead for mercy rather than contest their guilt. Helena maintained her dignity throughout the proceedings, arguing that her actions had been motivated by patriotic duty rather than personal ambition. But her words fell on deaf ears. King Edmund, despite his previous condemnation of the conspiracy, was reluctant to order the execution of his former consort and his own son. Instead, he sentenced Helena to permanent exile from the kingdom, stripping her of all titles and privileges, but allowing her to keep her life. Thomas was given a choice between exile with his mother or remaining in the kingdom as a prisoner under house arrest. Thomas chose exile, preferring freedom in foreign lands to a life of captivity and humiliation in the palace where he had once dreamed of ruling. Mother and son were given 3 days to prepare for their departure, after which they would be escorted to the border and banned from ever returning to the kingdom. Helena's network of supporters was dismantled completely. Some fled the kingdom voluntarily, while others were stripped of their positions and privileges, but allowed to remain as private citizens. The conspiracy that had once threatened to change the course of the kingdom's history was reduced to a cautionary tale about the dangers of ambition and the consequences of treason. Prince Marcus emerged from the crisis with his position strengthened and his authority enhanced. He had demonstrated both his awareness of threats against his rule and his ability to respond decisively when challenged. The nobles who had remained loyal to him were rewarded with increased influence and privileges, while those who had wavered were made to understand that their future prosperity depended on their continued support for the legitimate heir. In the months that followed, Marcus began to take a more active role in governance, perhaps motivated by Helena's criticisms of his previous indifference. He started attending council meetings regularly, involved himself in military planning, and even made efforts to address some of the concerns about the common people that Thomas had championed. King Edmund lived for another 2 years after Helena's exile, long enough to see his kingdom stabilized and his son prepared to take on the full responsibilities of rule. When the old king finally passed away peacefully in his sleep, Marcus ascended to the throne without challenge or controversy. Helena and Thomas settled in a distant kingdom where they lived quietly under assumed names. Helena never stopped believing that her cause had been just, even as she accepted that her methods had been flawed. Thomas eventually found purpose as a scholar and teacher, using his intelligence and education to help others while abandoning his dreams of political power. The palace that had once buzzed with conspiracy and intrigue returned to its normal rhythms of ceremony and administration. Helena's apartments were eventually converted into guest quarters for visiting dignitaries, and her name was gradually forgotten by all but those who had lived through the dramatic events of her attempted coup. The story of Helena's failed conspiracy became a legend within the palace walls, told to warn future generations about the dangers of unchecked ambition and the importance of loyalty to the legitimate order. Prince Marcus, now King Marcus, ruled for many years with wisdom and strength, and the kingdom prospered under his leadership. The shock attempt to claim the throne had been decisively defeated, the prince's fury had indeed cut short the consort's ambition, and the natural order of succession had been preserved. Helena had learned too late that in the dangerous game of palace politics, even the most careful planning could not guarantee success, and that the price of failure was often higher than the ambitious dared to imagine.